The 2022 gubernatorial elections. I'll tell you my prediction on the next segment. Hello everyone, welcome back to Luis Discusses Everything, and today we're going to discuss the 2022 gubernatorial elections, something that is lesser known in American politics, or at least is not as widely discussed as the Senate or the House midterm elections. But this is by far the most important of the elections in November of this year. So as you can see, the landscape for the gubernatorial elections is not as interesting nor competitive as you see in the Senate or the House elections. But regardless of that fact, the gubernatorial elections probably have a larger impact than federal offices or federal races. You can see that in most of these cases, you have either races already heavily in favor of the Democratic or Republican Party, with only 3 remaining states that have been categorized as toss-up. So that means that those are really the only hyper-competitive races that we have. Of course, the lighter colors, as you've seen in other videos, represent races that are a little bit closer. Now, this map represents the consensus estimate of most of the pundits that have given their own particular prediction. So this represents the average of all those pundits. And it also represents my own opinion as to how these races are going to shape up. Now, previously I mentioned the governor elections are a little bit even more important than senatorial elections. And there's a reason for that. Reason being that on a governor level, much of what is established ranges from the abortion issue, which happened recently, to healthcare, and whatever the local government, in this case the governor or the legislature, the state legislature of that state, decides will be the policy that will most directly affect the specific state. Take, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, which held renewable energy projects. If a state like California receives that funding, it will be up to the state to distribute that funding, right? That is just one example. Another example is the infrastructure bill that was passed the previous year, which allocated funding towards all sorts of infrastructure projects. In addition to the 2 other examples that I mentioned, another big reason why gubernatorial elections are important is because they also decide how elections will be managed in their respective state. In a state that I live in Massachusetts, voter ID are not required. In a state like Alaska, there is ranked choice voting that gives multiple options per each candidate. In a state like Georgia, there's a concept called as jungle primary. So you can see the huge amount of sway and power each of these governors have. And yet, a lot of these governors' races are rarely covered in media unless they're like highly profiled candidates or candidates that are worthy of news coverage by traditional mainstream media. With all that being said, that small explanation as to why governor races are important, I will go ahead and characterize these 3 remaining toss-up races and where do I think they would go. And for that, I'm going to look at our trusty old 538 forecast. Now in the 538 forecast, you see a very similar scenario in which you see most of these races already categorized. In fact, all of these races are categorized. And the 3 that are the focus of our attention, as we saw earlier, is Wisconsin, Kansas, and Arizona. Now, in the race for Wisconsin, you have Tony Evers, the Democrat, with a 67% chance of winning versus Tim Michels, the Republican. In this race, you would think that the Republican candidate has a higher chance of winning this race, considering the Senate race. In the Wisconsin Senate, you have essentially a toss-up. This is important to mention because gubernatorial races and Senate races usually don't align with each other. In other words, if you have a very unpopular candidate on the Senate side, that doesn't necessarily translate to the other candidate. For example, in the state of Georgia, you have Brian Kemp leading by a wide margin. I think in the most recent polls you have him up, by 6 points and an A- rated pollster. That is considerable, especially in a governor's race, especially in Georgia, that is a swing state. But in the Senate, it's a toss-up. So you have the governor very high up, but then in the Senate, you have it as a toss-up. Similar thing happens in Pennsylvania, where you have Josh Shapiro with an 85% chance of winning, But then in the Senate race, you have more of a closer race, a slightly closer race, but you get the idea. Going back to Wisconsin, I would say that definitely Tony Evers, the Democratic candidate, definitely has a more of a lean characterization, so a slightly blue. If you want to see the characterizations definitions, you can look up at the description below. Okay, moving on to Kansas. You have Laura Kelly, a much closer race. Laura Kelly has a 57% chance of winning the governor election. And I would agree with that, but I would say that that's notable because Kansas is a very conservative, Republican-leaning state, right? But with the Dobbs decision and the recent referendum, which protected abortion rights in the state, that catapulted Laura Kelly a little bit, or a scenario in which she would win. So I would characterize this specific state, Kansas, it is a toss-up, but I would give it as tilt Democrat. Moving on to the last state to be categorized, which is Arizona. Remember, in that race on the Senate side, you have Mark Kelly running for the senatorial race, but in the gubernatorial race, you have Katie Hobbs. The problem with Carrie Lake in this instance is that she is not only Trump aligned, but is also an election denier. And in the state of Arizona, election denying politics tend to not be very favorable, especially with a lot of retirees that move to the state from California or from New York, and their politics are generally more left-leaning, and any of these more extremist points of view are going to be frowned upon. It's still within the margin of error, but if I had to characterize it, I would definitely give it as a tilt to the Democratic Party, especially when you have Mark Kelly, the senatorial candidate, winning by such a high margin with a 74% chance of winning, and also leading in the polls consistently, even though the most recent race has him at plus 2%. But that leaves us with a 25-25 gubernatorial control by either party. This doesn't really have an effect in terms of like who's going to pass legislation. It's not like the Senate where you have 50-50, oh, who's going to control the Senate. This only will dictate how electoral policy is governed, how more local policies are, how much of the governorships is either party controlling. Well, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, subscribe, share this video with your friends. Check out the merch store to support the channel, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.